The purpose of this tutorial is to show the process of using cloth effects for simulating the webbing of a dragon wing. This same process can be used for doing bat wings or any other type of fleshy webbing. Here I have a dragon wing provided to me by TurboSquid. As you can see, it's one complete mesh, modeled all the way across the bones and the webbing. The first thing we need to do is to make a copy of this mesh and separate it into the bony rigid part and the webbing. That is simple modeling, so I'm just going to show you what it looks like once you do it. So you've got, here you can see I have two separate meshes now. The reason I had to do this is I only want to run the simulation on the webbing of the wing. Basically, I don't want to affect what's going to be driven by the bone structure. I only want to affect the webbing part of this wing. So I need to separate them out in order to actually isolate it to run the simulation. Now you don't want to run the simulation on this mesh right here because obviously there's too many faces, they're all different shapes and sizes. So we want to get something a little bit cleaner, something that will allow you to actually run the sim and have it run relatively quickly. So what we need to do is to create a face based on this topology right here. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the driver, and we're going to create a face on here. I'm just going to use a script that I have called create face attach to surface. It's just a quicker way for me to just create this face that I know is roughly the same as the original. So I'm just picking some points here. I basically have one point where I know there will be a bend in the wing and then another in between. And you can really put as many points as you want, or have many faces as you want. And once you're done, I'm going to have a nice clean mesh. If I freeze that, you can see this is what I've got. Now I'm going to go to subobject mode. First I'm going to kill the skin wrap. That's an automatic part of that script. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut these edges right here. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to eventually need to have a row of verts down the center of this polygon. I did it this way just to make it quicker for me to actually create the face. But before I do that, actually, what I want to do is, since that script is obviously called create face attach to surface, it's doing it on the surface of the face. So I want to take this and move these verts so they're in between the two parts of the webbing, the two layers of skin. Which is a good time for me to say that's why you don't want to run the simulation on this. Because if you did, you'd end up running it on something with thickness. And when you do that, you're either going to have to turn on self-collision, which is going to really increase the time that you need to run the sim. And you're still going to run a chance of having some interpenetration issues. You're better off just always running it on a thin piece of cloth rather than something that's thick. It just doesn't work very well. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. Go to edge mode, and I'm just going to select these edges right here, and I'm going to connect them, and then I'm going to cut this one last edge here. So there you go. I've got a nice clean mesh. Sorry. That I can run my simulation on. So the next thing I need to do is I need to copy, actually, the next thing I need to do, as you can see, I've already done this for the other two parts of the webbing, the two cells. So I'm just going to attach this object to this object. So I have one cloth object that I'm running the simulation on versus multiple cloth objects. No need to have that. So all I need to do at this point is to copy this skin modifier and paste it onto the dragon wing, the webbing. So I'm going to select these verts right here. I'll explain why in a moment. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to bake these verts because these verts are already the same as the corresponding mesh around them. So we're going to go ahead and say bake selected verts. That way what I'm going to end up doing right now is I'm going to change these envelopes so I can incorporate all the rest of these verts that are down the center. One thing to keep in mind is when you do run a cloth sim, you want to run it so that you always start from a default pose. You don't want to start with the character already posed for animation. You want to really get him in a default state. It's the only way to really, well, for one thing, when you start the simulation, it's going to be a lot more reliable. It's going to eventually transition into the animation rather than having to sit there and do a simulate local, which a lot of people do. They'll try and simulate local to get it to kind of get into the right place before they even get the animation started, which is just it's a lot of extra work that you don't need to do. By having a default state prior to running your sim, you're already starting from a relaxed position. Everything's already set up. There's no interpenetration, so you don't need to try and get the cloth to go anywhere. That'll happen as you transition into the animation. For example, if you're using biped, there's a script on this DVD that'll allow you to select the biped, run the script, and it will put a figure mode 20 frames before the start of the animation. That will allow you to transition from figure mode, which is where you set up your cloth, into the animation. So I'm going to go ahead now and apply cloth effects to this object. I've got my skin on it. I've already weighted everything I need to weight. So what I want to do is I want to add the cloth effects modifier. So let's go ahead and just add cloth effects. And I'm going to go to object properties, select that object and make it a cloth object. I'm just going to go with the defaults for right now because I just want to show you what it'll look like. But I am going to turn on edge springs because I want it to be tight. And I'm going to change the UV scale to 0.9. The reason I'm doing that is because I want each of the edges, to try and scale down to 0.9 of what they actually are. Basically, what cloth effects is doing in this case, or in any case, is it puts a spring on each edge of the mesh. You'll see, you'll see settings like stretch, like U stretch, V stretch, and that is the same. Is basically that's the resistance to how much this and this edge are going to stretch. Now you'll notice also that there's a shear setting. Now shear is what would be the spring that goes from here to here, across the face. That's your shear setting. So that way you can keep, so you wouldn't have a face that, starts out like this and then ends up like this if you have a real high shear setting, because it's going to try and keep it as square as it can. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and go into sub-object mode group, and I'm going to select all the verts that are on the edges of the webbing. The reason is I want to create a group, obviously, and preserve what they already have happening to them, meaning you're preserving the animation that's on those verts. They're not going to be part of the cloth sim, but they're going to drive the other verts in the cloth sim. So we're going to make a group, and I'm just going to call it pin for now. And we're going to make this a preserved group. Like I said, preserve means that whatever happens to these verts below the skin modifier will continue to happen after the skin modifier. Meaning, like, this vert right here is being driven by this bone right here. So when I run the cloth sim, that vert is going to continue to go with that bone. The verts that are in the center here, that I did not create the groups for, the preserved group, are going to go with the cloth sim. Whatever you simulate on them is what's going to happen to them. They're not just going to follow with the bones like these verts are going to. With that said, let's take a look at how the simulation will look. Now, if I just run the sim with the default settings the way they are, I already set the subsamples to 4. I mean, it's always good to increase the subsamples. The starting point that I usually start with is 4 or 5. You can get away with 1 with a lot of things. The only problem with 1 is, you're basically telling it how many times to look at the cloth per frame. And when you say 1, it's only going to it's going to be a lot faster, but it's not going to be as accurate. In some cases, it can work fine, but in a case like this, I'm going to probably have a lot of fast animation on these wings, so I'm going to want it to be at least 4. So we'll leave it at 4, and I'm going to just hit simulate. Okay, you'll notice I already have some animation, obviously. There really isn't that much play in the wing. If we do this, bring back my slider, you can see when I pull it up and down, they're barely moving. There's a little bit of give to them, but they're really, really tight. So the first thing that I'm going to play with to affect that, if I go to Object Properties, is I'm going to change the density from 0.005 to 0.05. Basically make it a lot heavier, so it's gonna hold its momentum more. The other settings that are going to affect something like this, like a webbing sim, will be the dampening and the air resistance. The air resistance is going to basically, tell it how much it will be affected by the air. Dampening is, how quickly it's going to get back to its resting state. So, I mean, if you're watching this DVD, you pretty much probably already know all of these settings. So, we'll just move on. So, now that I've increased the dampening, when I run the simulation, you can see there's a lot more motion now. And if we go ahead and rotate around like so, and I drag the slider, you can see there's a lot more motion. Okay, we're going to go ahead and leave it like that, because that's fine. And let's just drag this way. So we've got our cloth simulated, and we've got our geometry moving the way we need. So the next step is to take the actual drivers, the actual mesh itself, and have it be driven by the cloth object. Now there's one thing that I need to mention right now, and that is these two objects are going to be driving this object. The reason is we don't want to see a seam between the two objects. We've already had this modeled. We've already got the UV coordinates set up, the texture mapping, everything's set up the way we need it. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to skin wrap this complete mesh to these separate meshes. Now, the one thing that we have to keep in mind when we do that is the way that this is modeled, we don't want this part of the driver to affect this part here. So what we're going to do is we're going to select this mesh, and I'm going to select all the open edges. We're going to go back to edge mode, and we're going to deselect these because these I want to leave alone. Okay. And what I'm going to do now is very simple. Hit delete. I just don't want those shared edges. Now, you'll notice that it looks a little messy, which is just fine for what I need to do. As a matter of fact, we're going to go to vertex mode and delete the verts. That'll work a lot better for what we need to do. So now you can see we have a gap in between these two objects, and that is just fine. We're going to let skin wrap handle that. We don't want the skin wrap to control the verts that are in here. Okay, or we don't want this driver to affect what's going on in there. So now that we have these two objects separated out, I'm going to go ahead and hide the wing driver and bring back the cloth. So where we left off, I'm going to erase the simulation. All right, I'm going to hit simulate local. Now you'll see that it just popped right down. It basically went to its resting state, and you just let it run until it's not moving at all. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is I'm going to throw a mesh select modifier on top of this stack. Mesh select, when you do this, what it kind of does is it kind of collapses the stack in a sense. Max basically stops looking at everything. You know, it still calculates everything, but the next modifier will only see that there's a mesh select before it, not cloth. So I prefer to just do that personally. It just really seems to save time and energy, what have you. So what I want to do after that is, you know, since it is such a low poly face, what I want to do is I want to throw a quick mesh select on it, or a turbo smooth, let's say. A turbo smooth of 2. And you can see that gives us a lot more faces to skin wrap to. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and select this mesh. And I'm just going to run skin wrap. I'm going to put a skin wrap on this mesh so that it's driven by the cloth mesh. So I just have a quick shortcut to do that, and I just go bind surface to deformer, and I select that. And all that is skin wrap. It's just a quick way to do skin wrap. So now if I go ahead and go back to the cloth, we'll erase the simulation and reset state. I want to mention something quick about reset state. When you set up a cloth sim like this, when you move this character around, you'll notice that the cloth objects won't move until you hit reset state. That's why you want to skin your cloth objects to the rig. I'm going to go ahead and bring in my controls. Now if I go ahead and just move this, we'll bring back this part of it. Oh, I'm sorry, actually. The skeleton. So we'll take that, we'll just move this around. You'll see that the cloth mesh isn't moving at all. Now if I grab this and turn off the cloth and then try to move this, it moves with it. That's not actually skinned anything, that's why it stayed there. So let's get rid of the skeleton and let's turn the cloth back on. So what you would do is when you move something, once like for the example of the biped idea, you've got your stuff all set up in figure mode, or in the case of a custom rig, in a default pose. So when you load your animation on it, it's obviously not going to be in that 000 position, whatever. It's going to be wherever you animated it. So what you will need to do is select your cloth objects and hit reset state. So they'll pop right into place. You need to skin your cloth objects to your object. Not link it. It just doesn't work as well. It should be unlinked and skinned to it. So now that we have this all set up, and now that we have this skin wrapped, I can go ahead and run a full cloth simulation on this. So I'm just going to hide my controls, and I'm going to put this into box mode because I really don't even need to see the mesh anymore. So I'm just going to run the simulation, and you can see this mesh is now moving with that cloth mesh. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at that again. We can hide the cloth mesh now because I've already got the sim done on it. So you see what's happening there? It's actually being driven by that cloth mesh. So we're almost done. Now all we need to do is to skin wrap the main wing, which is this mesh, to the two driver meshes. So what I like to do is once I get the drivers set up, I like to put them in box mode because I no longer need to see them. All I need is this mesh. So again, I'm going to skin wrap this to these two objects. So in my case, bind surface to multiple deformers. And I'm going to hit cancel. Sorry about that. For some reason I had a duplicate entry in the max window and just something got left behind, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and skin wrap this mesh to these two objects. So I'm going to go bind surface to multiple deformers and hit bind and wait for skin wrap to do its thing. The scripts I have are just little quick front ends to skin wrap, basically so that you can have your object selected, run the script, and then be able to just select the objects you want to skin wrap to. In the case of doing, one object skin wrapping to another, it allows you to just select one object and then rubber band it. It's just a little quicker. There's no difference between it at all. So now we have this object, these two objects driving this object. So as you can see here, I have my mesh skin wrapped to these two. I can go ahead and hide them. And when I drag the time slider, I now have the high-res mesh being driven by the full mesh being driven by the two chopped up meshes. I have the skin wrapped mesh that is being driven by the cloth simulation, and then I have the skinned part of the mesh of the dragon here that is being driven by skin. So I have those two separate objects now driving the one complete mesh, which is across both objects. And if I go ahead and then throw turbo smooth on this, which you would do before you render anyways, let's say a turbo smooth of 2, and let's turn on isoline display, you'll see I've got a real nice curve. It's really smooth. And again, I mean, I just quickly whipped through this. You know, I didn't spend too much time tweaking the settings. I just wanted to basically take you through the process of how to set it up and to show you that it's not something that takes forever. It's not a hard thing to do. There's so many ways that you can save time using cloth effects to do stuff like this. I'm sure you can imagine if you had, you know, if you had put a bone chain through here and then put some sort of flex or reactor sim on it, I mean, it would take a lot longer. The one thing to keep in mind, though, sorry, the one thing to keep in mind, I mean, this is a simple sim. I just wanted to run a simulation through the center of this. So I only had that one line in the driver. But if I wanted to have wings that when I brought them in, like if I was to take this and bring it in, and I wanted it to get nice little folds in it, all I would need to do is to do some more connects and actually have some more faces through the center. It would allow you to fold up the wings and then have them, you know, fold up basically to get nice little, you know, curves in it. The only difference you would probably need to do is to change the UV scale setting from 0.9 to maybe 0.95, so they're only stretching a little bit. Other than that, I mean, this is pretty much it. You can, again, use this for any other type of stretchy fabric, or in this case, dragon wings, webbing. You could do the webbing of a foot. You could do a bat wing. You could use it in a lot of different instances. You could use it for an elephant's ears. You could, you know, do the spine of the ear using bones and then actually simulate the actual floppiness of the ears. So any type of thin flesh that needs to stretch or fold, you can do this way. So that's it for this tutorial. Thank you.